Hi, everybody. I'm making this recording to illustrate what you can do with your visual perception project for this unit. You'll see that the requirements ask you to provide examples through photographs of 7 different monocular cues and 5 different Gestalt grouping or organizational principles. And there's lots of ways that you could do this. I'm choosing to do mine through a recording. You could do it through still shots and text on the screen as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be an auditory recording. I just thought this would give you a better sense of what the project could look like. You do want to make sure if you choose to do something without narration that your text actually explains the principles clearly enough that I can see that you know the thing. So I'll try and explain my examples in a way that shows you I understand what these monocular cues and Gestalt grouping principles are all about. So here we're looking at a photograph that I took while on a hike with my husband this fall when we were up north at a state recreation area. It actually illustrates several of the monocular cues that we use to judge depth in our natural environment. So one that pops out to me when I look at this is texture gradient. We rely on the textures of the surfaces that we're seeing to tell us how close we are. When we're close to something, the textures will seem very coarse and distinct, like here you can see the individual grains on the wood of the boardwalk, but as we get further away, it appears more smooth. That stuff is similarly happening to the grassy reeds here. Up close, we can see the coarse texture. Further in the background, it becomes smooth, and that alone can be a cue for distance. We're also seeing linear perspective in this image. That includes one of the limits of human vision makes it seem as though parallel lines appear to converge with distance. And here we have some parallel lines in the form of the edge of the boardwalk. They're further apart, those two parallel lines, here and here, when we're closer. As we get further off in the distance, it does appear that the edges of the boardwalk seem to be coming together in the distance, and that's a linear perspective. Just kidding. Okay, so our next monocular cue, I hit the button too far there, is relative height. So relative height is a depth cue that shows up in paintings and photographs. Stuff that is closer to us tends to literally be lower in whatever thing that we're looking at in the 2D image. So the stuff that's closer to us is down here, whereas the stuff that's further away up here in the trees and whatnot and the sky, that's furthest distance from us. So it's literally higher up in the image than this lower stuff, which is closer. That's relative height as a depth cue. Now, relative size is something that's easy to confuse with relative height because they sound so similar, but relative size refers literally to the size of objects whose height is presumed to be known. So here we have a person. This was a picture I took when we were on vacation hiking in Bryce Canyon National Park. So we can see people hiking up this trail that has lots and lots of switchbacks and whatnot. So here we have a hiker that's closer to us. If we look at his actual size, he or she, actually, I don't even know, like, oh, it looks like there's a couple people there. Okay, this person is bigger than these tiny, tiny dots of people that are presumably pretty far away. Now, we realize that they're actually the same size. Humans are about the same size, but because this one is casting a larger retinal image than this one, I know this one is closer to me. That's relative size. On that same trip, we actually visited Zion National Park, and that gave us opportunities to take pictures of other things that would reveal some depth cues. Relative clarity sort of is what it sounds like. It refers to the clarity of the image. Stuff that's closer to us tends to be pretty clear, so stuff that's in the foreground down here, including to some extent myself, seems clear and distinct. But in the background, things are looking fuzzy or hazy, which is a typical phenomenon for humans when they're looking at stuff further away. So that cue, the haziness, actually tells us that something is further away, whereas the clear stuff is closer to us. Interposition is also showing up in this one. Interposition is just when a closer thing blocks your view of further distant objects, and I'm actually doing that for you in this picture. So we got that line of me here, but because I'm standing there, you can't see some of this other stuff behind me, these rocks and cliffs and whatnot. This is at observation point for those of you who like hiking and whatnot, so I'm pretty high up in the air here. But because I'm blocking or partially obscuring your view of those things, you know I am closer to you than those things. Another thing that's shown up in this picture as a depth cue is light and shadow. Because our brains assume that light always comes from above, anything that's casting a shadow, we assume has depth because it's blocking some of that light from reaching the ground. And to some extent, that gives us cues about distance because, okay, for one, it helps us form this idea that these are 3D objects, even though I'm looking at a 2D image. But we also have examples where the shadow, the stuff that's darkened, like some of these rocks, usually the surfaces that are reflecting less light back to us are the ones that are further away. So even within a particular rock, the surfaces that are closer are brightest, and the stuff that is further distant, even within that rock, seems a little darker. But those are our monocular depth cues. They tend to show up in lots of paintings and photographs, so I think that you'll be able to find some great ones either within your own camera roll or maybe go out and find some in the natural world. I'm going to choose to illustrate some of the Gestalt grouping principles here with images of quilts that I've made for various things, because although you can find Gestalt grouping principles everywhere, they are just ways that we organize our visual and even auditory worlds to some degree. These are not used to judge distance, and I want to be clear about that, because even though this project combines monocular cues for depth, which are ways that we determine distance, the Gestalt grouping principles aren't used to determine distance. They're used to group objects together or create organized wholes or forms. That's what Gestalt literally means, is whole or form. And the early psychologists who studied this were interested in how it is that we see objects or entities as unified things rather than their separate component pieces. So, for example, one basic principle of Gestalt organizational rules is figure and ground. We have to be able to perceive objects, whatever that object is, as being distinct from its background. Any particular thing you look at, actually, you have to be able to separate out from everything surrounding it. And in this particular quilt, which I made for my friend Maria, we have these white stars, which we have to be able to perceive as somehow separate and different from the things around them. And in this case, color is helping give us a clue about that, but it makes the star the figure and everything else behind it the background on each of the individual quilt blocks. Quilters like to play around sometimes with reversible figure and ground by maybe changing, instead of having the white be the figure, we could make the white the background in the star blocks and get a really different look on the quilt. So crafters, yeah. Okay, so another Gestalt grouping principle or organizational principle is proximity, which just refers to the fact that we group we group together things that are closer to each other. Proximity literally means like geographic nearness. So in this quilt, which I made for the Tillis's baby, Charlotte, a couple years ago now, we've got a bunch of blocks that appear to be aligned in columns. And when we look at this, we see 4 separate columns rather than just 36 individual blocks. And that's because these squares are closer to each other than they are to things in the other seemingly like column. So because these are closer to each other, we're grouping them together in a particular line or column rather than seeing them all as mixed together. Oh, I think I had a back one there. Okay, so we also can see in this particular quilt a Gestalt grouping principle called connectedness. And this one is a little trickier sometimes for students to spot and understand. Connectedness refers to the fact that when objects or pieces of something are uniform, so usually uniform in color or pattern, and linked, so like touching each other, then we perceive them as one thing rather than their component pieces. So we see connectedness actually in how these individual blocks were constructed, because if you look closely at where the seams are, each of these little green or white squares is composed of 1, 2, 3, 4 separate pieces of fabric with a gray square in the center. But rather than seeing those as 4 separate pieces, because they're the same color, because they're touching each other, when we look at this, we see it as one particular square, like with a donut hole in the middle, if you want to think about it that way, a block. And that's a connectedness issue. Now, this is a quilt that has a bunch of cat faces on it, which is kind of fun to do. A very simple grouping principle that appears within it is we group objects based on whether they have similar characteristics or properties, or so similar features to each other. And that's why, for example, if you're watching a basketball game, you can tell who's on what team even though the basketball players are intermingled with each other, because typically they're wearing different colored uniforms, so you can group them by color. That would be using similarity. In this case, we've got two cats that are wearing glasses, so they're similar to each other in that property, so it's easy to have them kind of stand out as being related to each other compared to all the other cat faces that we see on the quilt top. Now, you could also group these guys by color as well. You could mentally create a grouping of like, oh, here's the orange cat faces, here's the pink ones, and see them as kind of on the same team or group, and count them as separate and distinct from the others. Anytime you're using a similar feature of the things that you're looking at to form groups, that's a similarity rule. Now, one thing that I'm going to show you examples of in class is a Gestalt grouping principle called continuity. Continuity is just the fact that we have, as humans, we love smooth and continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. So we like lines and lines that continue without interruption. This particular quilt, its design actually sort of exploits this, because each of these pieces, when you look at the line that was created here, there's half square white triangles that were made to create that of the blocks on either side, and then sashing pieces that are white between them. But most of us, when we look at that, don't actually form the organization of it that way. We see kind of these two stripes or continuous lines because our mind likes to extend that in a continuous fashion rather than seeing it as a discontinuous or like grouping of component pieces. So preference for smooth and continuous lines showing up there. And closure is a Gestalt grouping principle where things don't even have to be touching for us to mentally organize or group them together into a whole object. Closure just refers to the fact that, okay, if different pieces of a thing are separated and not touching, we can mentally close them in to create a full and complete image. So you're seeing that in kind of, not these blocks because those are full-on star blocks that are actually closed. These pieces, the darker part of the star that we're looking at, there's actually just 8 dark triangles that are creating that. They barely, or in some cases, don't even touch each other at the junctions, but it's very easy for us to mentally close that in as one full and complete object and say, oh, that's a star. Look, oh, here's a star formed by the outline of this thing. So we're mentally closing in the edges so that there are no gaps in our understanding of that thing to create a complete figure. And that's the last of our Gestalt grouping principles. I hope you enjoyed the little tour and seeing all the quilts and my vacation pictures and whatnot, and I'm looking forward to seeing your projects.